What has happened to America's finest city? 10 years ago, San Diego was being touted as the first great city of the 21st century. Today, it's a town in turmoil. Good evening, I'm Michael Marcotte. It's Full Focus Friday, and tonight we're dedicating our program to San Diego's financial and legal crisis. All this week, KPBS radio and TV have been putting a spotlight on the crisis, its history, how it grew, and how it may affect you. Our panel tonight is comprised of 4 local reporters who are very familiar with the story. Alison St. joins us from the KPBS newsroom. Matt Hall is here from the San Diego Union-Tribune. From the brand new web service Voice of San Diego, we have Andrew Donohue. And we also have legal reporter Amita Sharma of KPBS News. The basic facts on the table are these. San Diego runs a system to reward its workers after they retire. That pension system is underfunded by more than $1 billion. How the city got into that situation has become increasingly clear. What's not clear is if laws were broken. And while the city is trying to fix this mess, it's stuck with a bad credit rating and unable to finance new projects. So let's dig into how this thing began. And Alison, let me turn to you. Let's go back a few years. Will you tell me, where do you think this thing starts?
Well, perhaps if we take a general impression of the situation, which is that San Diego is a city which has a lot of ambition, has a lot of high goals, wanted to have the Republican National Convention, wanted to have a new baseball park, soon wants to have a new library, and is a low-revenue city. So in terms of revenue versus expenditure, we've wanted the goodies, but we haven't really wanted to pay. And in the meantime, we've got this pension fund in the background, which is sitting there looking very plump and pretty and very tempting for the people who are trying to fund these projects. So way back as far as the 1980s, in a sense, that pension fund was being used for things that it shouldn't have been used for. It was being used to pay for the medical expenses, for example, of retirees, which was supposed to have come from another pot. So, we get to the point perhaps in 1996 where we had Maureen O'Connor, Susan Golding, I beg your pardon, I'm one mayor behind there. Susan Golding, who wanted to have the Republican National Convention in town. The then city manager, Jack McGrory, was looking for a way to fund something that I remember at the time it was a bit questionable. How can we fund this convention? And he came up with a way of restructuring the payments into the pension plan. He, of course, will deny that it was underfunding because at the time the plan was fully funded because the market was good. So from his point of view, it was restructuring. But that started this process of underfunding it gradually, little by little, which came cataclysmically, shall we say, to a point where the markets crashed and the pension fund could no longer sustain the kind of funding that the city was putting into it. It basically started to meet a trigger point where we should have started to pull out. And that was a crucial moment in 2002. And the city council and the mayor did not make the change of course necessary to pull out of what has now become a crisis.
And I think Alison is absolutely right. Everyone focuses on the 2002 decision to underfund and increase benefits, but the problem really did start in 1996 when that first decision was made to underfund, because that's where you run afoul of state law. The California Constitution requires you to fully fund pension systems, and that means that you have the money to make payments as payments are due on that pension system and as benefits are created, and that's where the problem started, and then it just spiraled out of control in 2002.
Anything you want to add to this in terms of setting the table here?
Well, actually, it's quite interesting. I don't want to bring out the bankruptcy word right away, but a lot of people search for similarities between Orange County and San Diego, and if you really go back to Proposition 13 in 1978, what it did was it affected the property tax, and here you have Orange County and San Diego, two very fiscally conservative areas in the time, and they didn't raise taxes like a lot of other places did, and so you kind of kept the same revenue streams, but you added more expenditures, and then you looked for more creative ways to kind of fund those things, and we all know what happened in Orange County, and now we're looking at what's happening now.
That is a key point. We had Jack McGrory, former city manager, on radio this week. We're asking him about what was happening back there in the 90s, and he too pointed at Prop 13 as probably the thing that really kind of starts the snowball rolling here.
And that's also an interesting question. I mean, everyone likes to blame the politicians and blame the bureaucrats, but what responsibility does the public have I mean, they have said time and again that, they don't even want to pay for their trash. And we're one of the few cities who doesn't charge for a trash collection. But there is another issue too. If the city was in dire financial shape in 2002, as it seems that it was with the pension fund, why wasn't the public told about this situation? Why wasn't it told? The city council found out about the pension funds, the pension fund heading toward that trigger point, which would have required a balloon payment, and the public didn't find out about it basically until 2004. Why wasn't the public told?
I think some people might say, well, the figures were actually all there on the books. What it took was somebody to put the spotlight on it and say, hey, this is a problem. And as we know, the Blue Ribbon Committee failed to really make that case as strongly as they could have. But I was
Blue Ribbon Committee, this is a special committee that Dick Murphy impaneled, right, to look over the city's finances and give it sort of a clean bill of health.
Good move on the part of the mayor. I mean, I think he wanted to find out what the financial situation was in the city, so he commissioned this committee, which came out with its report in early 2002.
And this is soon after Murphy was elected in 2000, is that right?
Right. And the problem with that report was that it underplayed the problems, along with really the whole culture at City Hall was to underplay the problems, I think, at that time.
Well, there are some actually who say that the report did, paint a pretty good picture of what was happening. There are others now, new memos are surfacing that were circulating at the time that said, from Richard Vortman, who's a member of the pension board and a member of the Blue Ribbon Committee, who said at the time, I think we're doing a disservice. We're not ringing a loud enough bell. We're not letting people know the extent of the problem. But others say, and even Richard Vortman himself would say, anyone who read that report rather than putting on a shelf would know, look, we're in a serious problem here. This is the pension system is going to cause us some issues. There are problems with the budget, and it needs to be addressed immediately, if not sooner.
And this is key in 2002 because that's when the economy started to implode. That's when the stock market
2000 actually, and then 2001 is when the pension fund earnings started to plummet. And you can sort of see it. It actually happened all quite fast, faster, I think, than we're the 7th largest city in the nation, than a big city bureaucracy knew how to respond. And of course, when people started to realize, their first reaction was, my God, we can't let this get out. So it should have gotten out faster, and there should have been more leadership to respond to it. But a combination of people saying, we need to make this look as good as possible, and we can't take hundreds of millions of dollars out of the general fund, resulted in sort of a smoothing it all over.
But shifting back to the legal perspective, so the city knew, the city council was getting a clear picture of just what kind of shape the pension fund was in. They didn't tell the public. While it may have been in the Blue Ribbon Commission, I mean, what member of the public is going to go check out that report? But the city did not tell Wall Street either. When it made those bond offerings, it did not present a clear picture of the deficit in the pension fund.
Right, and that's where we are now. That's what's accelerated the mess now. We have all sorts of federal investigations going on into that very question.
So there's two main things going on here. One was the decision to underfund the pension fund. The other was the decision to kind of keep it under wraps. Let's just take a look for a second at the decision to underfund the pension deficit. Who can walk us through just a couple of the key moments in time, the key decisions, and how those came about?
Well, I think if you look in about October of 2001, you kind of have, like you had mentioned, the earnings are starting to fall in the system, and before such a strong market was kind of holding up this system that had a lot of flaws, but because it was getting such good returns, nobody saw those flaws. They were obscured. And now we have the earnings fall, and people are starting to realize, hey, we're going to get towards this trigger payment, which is going to be, which means the city's going to have to pay $25, $50, now it looks like it was even more than that, $1 million, a lump sum payment in 1 year, and the city's like, well, hey, we can't afford that in our budget. So then they go to the pension board and say, hey, we can't make this payment. And the pension board's like, well, hey, we need to get something in exchange, and there you have Manager Proposal 2, which came about in November, which was approved in November, and basically unions got better benefits, and the city got off the hook for this large payment.
We have to be careful about how we talk about it, because we don't know if we can't really say the pension fund said, hey, we have to get something in return, but I think that's implied, and in fact that was a strategy that had been used across time. It wasn't a new strategy at all. It was sort of accepted that, hey, if you sweeten the deal, then we'll accept that you'll be pushing the payments off into the future.
And the word contingent is used many times there, and I think that makes everything quite clear.
And also, I mean, there's that particularly damning memo from Terry Webster where she talks about Terry Webster is the city auditor, or the assistant city auditor at that time, and she talks about persuading Ron Satoff, the head of the fire union, to go along with the underfunding, and that his presidential benefit is basically contingent upon him being able to get the rest of the board to go along with the underfunding.
This is Ron Satoff sitting on the pension board.
He's a pension trustee. He's the head of the city fire union, and he stood to receive a benefit from getting the rest of the board to go along with this plan. And again, that's where you run afoul of the law. I mean, ex-federal prosecutors say, look, this looks like a quid pro quo. This guy may have used his power on that board, and Terry Webster writes in her memo that he runs the show at the pension board. So he may have used his power on that board for personal gain.
Now, all of this has to pass muster by the mayor and city council, right?
Yes. Well, and it also has to pass muster by the pension board and its external auditors, who are sitting there outside the whole situation watching to see if the pension board is fulfilling its fiduciary duty of keeping the pension fund. So you may ask, well, how did it get past all of these watchdogs? And I mean, I think Amita's right that in terms of the actual pension board, that was one incentive, was to sweeten the deal. But the external auditor, they originally said, no, this ain't going to fly. And the city had to go back and sweeten its deal a little bit, not very much. It went from 0.5 to 1%. It sort of doubled its funding. In other words, it underfunded a little bit less than it was underfunding before. And that's the move that they could say, well, perfectly legal. We decided it was better than it was before, so we said okay to it. So what's a little unclear is whether, in fact, that offer from the city is why they agreed to this plan, or whether it was sweetening the individual people's pension benefits.
But it sounds like it did. That's what Dick Bortman said.
It does.
Now let's jump over to the other thing that we had just set aside a moment ago, and that is this business of hiding any bad information from the bond markets. What are we looking at in terms of the evidence that we're able to see that there is actually, potential wrongdoing here?
Well, that actually is kind of what started most recently. That in January 27th, 2004, the city volunteered that it had omitted information in its bond disclosures. They hadn't disclosed the depths and the scope of the pension deficit. And shortly thereafter...
And is this after a series of reports in your newspaper, Matt? Is that what kind of brought this to light? What triggered this revelation on the part of the city?
That's a good question. I mean, our newspaper has been doing stories actually going back to 96 and in 2002, kind of weighing in on some of the public votes on the pension system, and shortly after that omission on January 27th, that admission is when the federal investigation started. And that's kind of what has really triggered the acceleration of this discussion, because you have the Securities and Exchange Commission looking at possible securities fraud, and you have the FBI, the U.S. Attorney, who are looking for possible public corruption. No one's been indicted yet, so who knows how this whole thing is going to shake out. But there are these ongoing investigations, and many of these questions are going to get answered at some point. The question is obviously when and what the fallout will be.
I think that memo that was uncovered in relation, I think it was Dick Bortman's memo, it's talking about the unspoken concerns about the ballpark bonds. Seems to be
Dick Bortman again was on the Blue Ribbon
Commission. He's also on the pension board.
And on the pension board.
Right.
And the memo you're talking about kind of came separately, where he was
he's talking
showing some kind of regret about how.
Oh, well, that's a different memo. There are so many memos. You should get a hold of Aguirre's report, which is fascinating reading. It's like a mystery, isn't it?
Okay.
This was more him saying that there was some unspoken concerns regarding the bond funding for the ballpark. And so that provides a sort of the missing link I mean, we can, in retrospect, it looks to those of us that are trying to make sense of all this like that. It would be a really good motivation to fail to disclose to the bond fund, the investors.
Though if you talk to people that were on the Blue Ribbon Committee, they say that they had an unstated concern that because of all the litigation behind the ballpark at the time, if you remember, there was a lot of litigation and there was kind of question marks whether or not they were going to finish the ballpark. They were afraid that the higher interest rates would come about because of these lawsuits, and that was the unstated concern, not the actual pension liability.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to bring it back to the federal investigation. Last week, the federal grand jury subpoenaed all communication, emails, letters going to Mr. Gibson, who is a senior policy advisor to Mayor Dick Murphy, and also the city administrator for the ballpark. So I believe federal investigators are looking at the link between the ballpark and what else has happened with the city finances.
Let's talk about Mayor Murphy a little bit here, and we'll talk about some of the other players in all of this. But I want to start off by, first of all, just saying on the record that Dick Murphy has said there is no crisis. And in fact, we had him on Full Focus last night, and this is how he put it.
I think that's very...
1 second.
Lori, I think it has been blown out of proportion. It is let me make it clear though, the pension deficit is a serious problem. $1.4 billion is not chicken feed, but that is what the city owes its retirees over the next 30 years. It is an actuarial projection of what we're going to owe them over a period of time. It is going to impact our ability to provide some services, but it's not going to cause bankruptcy, and it's not going to be a catastrophic problem.
I just see that as very indicative of Mayor Murphy's style. He is very much one to pour oil on troubled waters, to downplay it. He's a steady leader, calm, and maybe, but maybe not. That's what the markets and the residents of San Diego are looking for. And so, you have a choice of leadership styles here. One of them is the mayor saying there is no crisis, and you can look at it from that perspective. I mean, if you even just look at the budget that's coming up, the mid-year report that's coming up next week in City Council, the pension deficit is not necessarily the make or break item. There's a lot of things hitting the city all at once at this point. But is this the kind of leadership that the markets are looking for, or do they want someone who is going to acknowledge that there is a problem and who's going to take some drastic steps?
Matt, I'm curious. You cover City Hall day in and day out. What's your sense from inside the building? Do you feel like you're covering a crisis?
I mean, there are some major problems with the city's finances right now. I mean, people can, talk about crisis or use some other word. In my mind, where the rubber hits the road is that people's services are going to be impacted this year and in the budget that they're going to draft for fiscal '06. I mean, look at the storms that just hit this region in early January, and then again just this last week. In the first round of storms, the city puts a number about $7 million of the impact from those storms. They haven't made an estimate for the cost of what it will take to repair some of the damage this last week, but that's one concrete example of services that money has to come from somewhere. The mayor has asked the federal government to help out, but there's a good chance that potholes won't be fixed as quickly, and some of the other parks won't be maintained. I mean, they're going to have to make some major decisions are going to have to be made here this year and next year. Alison alluded to the mid-year budget report. Police and fire budgets are expected to be $11 million over budget. That money's got to come from somewhere. City Manager Monteule has put forth a plan that he says will present a balanced budget by the end of the year, but in that report he acknowledges that services are going to have to be impacted in non-public safety areas, 5% across the board. So people's phone calls maybe won't get answered as quickly when the public calls in for services, or who knows how it's going to play out. Fiscal '06 is going to be even a tougher problem. You mentioned the pension fund. This year, the city's paying $130 million out of its general fund for daily operations into pension payments. Next year, that figure is going to be $155 million. That's $25 million extra dollars. That's not,
And the general fund is just over $800 million. So to put it in context,
so put it in perspective,
that's a hefty chunk.
Fair chunk of it.
And you would think in the eyes of city employees who are now, looking at their union contracts being renegotiated with some pretty harsh, cutbacks being put on the table, I'm thinking they might see this as a crisis.
Yeah, that's very true. And I mean, we all get accused of being a little sensational here, and everybody's definition of the word crisis is different. But Mayor Murphy also said in November and December of 2002 that, hey, we've got a plan to tackle this pension problem. Don't worry about it. And now we're just starting to see plans come on the table. So.
And the city's credit rating has been downgraded numerous times. It's been suspended. The city cannot borrow money. It cannot sell bonds on over 20 projects, water projects, sewer projects, wastewater treatment projects. Library hours are being reduced. Parks cannot be repaired. The city's fire station can't be rebuilt now. I mean, everything is on hold. So I think that while he says, it's being blown out of proportion, that might be calm and reassuring to some people, but to other people, and I think a growing segment of people, it's sort of more of that head in the sand mentality that's gotten us into this very situation to begin with.
And people realize that. I mean, you alluded to the fact that a lot of projects have been put on hold. I mean, that is a major problem.
And that's
since December, and some of those projects are mandated by the federal and state government. We're talking sewer pipes and water projects.
And we can't refinance ballpark bonds. And that's going to cost us $90 million. That could save us $90 million in lower interest rates. We can't do that.
And what's at issue here is the city hasn't been able to produce an audit for 2003, and now we're overdue on the 2004 audit. And there's a lot of money being spent to produce that audit for 2003. The city's hired an outside auditor, KPMG, a worldwide firm who's going to come in and hopefully release this audit. But KPMG said because of all the investigations, because of all the questions around City Hall, around the pension system and other issues, that it's not going to release that audit until some questions get answered, and some of this wrongdoing allegations can either be confirmed or denied.
That brings us back to the legal issues, the corruption charges, and that sort of thing. And of course, Mike Aguirre has given us his professional opinion on all of this. But aren't we really waiting for the U.S. Attorney to speak, for the Securities and Exchange Commission to speak on this? Where are those answers?
Well, they're not talking. They're not talking. And there is some indication that some of the information that Mike Aguirre is trotting out, these folks, the U.S. Attorney's Office, they don't even have that information. They haven't gotten that information yet. I mean, altogether, there are about 75 boxes of documents that have just recently been produced. So
You sort of wonder if the U.S. Attorney and the investigators are waiting for the audit to come out, and the audit is waiting for the investigations to be complete.
Is there any sign? Are you seeing any sign that audit is coming out soon?
Well, on Monday, actually, the council is going to consider giving more money to KPMG to help produce that audit.
But is more money going to do it?
Well, I mean, the thing is, the city's kind of, caught over a barrel in a sense. They have to get that audit out. They have to get this work done to complete some of the internal investigations, and that has to be done, almost regardless of the cost.
When you look at the whole ball of wax, that audit is the thread. If you could just pull that audit out, everything would start to fall into
because once they
place.
get those audits out, and the Wall Street has a sense of what the city's finances are, then they'll be able to return to the bond market. Then these projects that have been on hold will be able to resume, and at that point, the city can kind of begin moving forward, and this standstill, in a sense, would be over. The federal investigations would continue. And
with only about 2 minutes left, I am curious what some of those other steps on the way out of this mess are. What are some of those key steps?
I think that if the SEC does find that there is securities fraud on the part of the city, that rebuilding trust on Wall Street is going to be really painful, and it's going to be quite costly, because the people who hold those bonds, the investors who purchase those bonds, have the right to rescind those bonds or renegotiate them. If they renegotiate them, then it's going to be much more beneficial to them, and the city could end up paying like $50 to $100 million.
That's true. What about restoring trust in City Hall?
Well, I feel like the leadership question is still there. We have two suits that are challenging the election that are still both under appeal. One of them's coming up next month, the next one in the 2 or 3 months. We have the possibility of a recall hanging over the mayor's head. The leadership is still so uncertain.
And the change to strong mayor as the new form of government in this town, which is very interesting.
And
of course,
there's a big thing to watch too over the next couple of months. months is going to be how the union negotiations play out. I mean, that is key to resolving some of the city's financial issues.
Okay. Would you believe we've run out of time already? That wraps up our week-long series on San Diego's financial and legal crisis. But you can be sure that we'll talk more about this story in future shows. To learn more about everything we've talked about, go to our website, kpbs.org, and let us know what you think about our show. Write to us at the address on the screen. Okay, thanks to our guests, Alison St. Andrew Donohue, Matt Hall, and Amita Sharma. Join us again Monday night when Full Focus brings you a look at an ambitious plan to create a 52-mile river park along our overlooked resource, the San Diego River. For KPBS, I'm Michael Marcotte. Have a good weekend.